Notes, a birthday present for my friend Emily, who, wanted a Twilight slash fic, so I gave it a try. Jacob knew from the first moment he saw him. The tug of the imprinting was like a sudden flash of cool air against his hot skin, and Jacob gasped out a soft breath. Judging by the sudden glance, the vampire had heard. And Jesus, vampire. How was it even possible? He should have imprinted on a human, a nice human. Someone like Bella. Or no, Bella herself. Bella was the love of his life, wasn't she? The words Jacob was supposed to say had disappeared from his mind. He wondered how this would affect the pack. Vampires and werewolves were natural enemies after all. He was supposed to warn Bella, to tell her that if she became a vampire, then there would be war. There would have to be war. The fragile treaty between the Cullens and the tribe would be broken. And here he was, suddenly imprinting on his love's dead boyfriend. Jacob? Bella looked confused, reaching towards him. Edward's arms came around her waist to pull her back, and Jacob couldn't help the low growl that came out of his throat. Bella stepped back, trying to put herself in between him and Edward. But he realized as he shook his head, it wasn't Edward he was jealous of in that moment. It was Bella. Jacob? Bella called after him as he turned and began to run. He would have turned back to reassure her, should have, but it wasn't the right voice, and at that moment, it was only the soft tones of the vampire, of his imprinted mate, that would have stopped him. Edward didn't say a word. Jacob closed his eyes, head thumping against the tree he sat under. Reflection had never been his strong point, but in the face of the worried glances of his tribe, he'd had no choice but to mumble a quick excuse and escape into the forest. Here, pressed up against bark, his chest and feet bare, the implications of his situation had come unwillingly to him. He remembered when he first met Bella, how he'd dismissed her as just another ignorant high school girl that he was told to play nice with. That was until they'd walked together on the beach and he'd start to develop what though had been a crush, turned into love. But now he realized that he'd only gotten interested in her when she'd begun to ask about Edward Cullen. Was that already the imprinting at work? Nearly every time they'd met, she'd had Edward's scent all over her. What was that? Why he'd been so attracted to her? It wasn't an explanation he liked, but it made sense. Jacob may never had been to public school, but he'd been taught more than just basic math on the reservation, and in the last year he'd grown into his skin, both as a young man and as a new werewolf. He was confident of himself and his strengths. And he knew better than to lie to himself. Damn it, Jacob cursed, banging his head back again on the tree. You shouldn't do that. You might lose the few good brain cells you have. The voice startled Jacob and soothed him all at once. He cursed himself for not having noticed the vampire approached, but then those creatures were as fast as cars, or a werewolf running at full speed, and he'd had Edward's scent lingering in his nose from the earlier encounter already. Jacob couldn't bear to let himself look at the vampire, knowing that if he did, he would have very little control over his actions that followed. Edward, it seemed, had no such worry as he knelt down besides the wares so that Jacob could make out his jean-covered legs and the hint of pale fingers hanging over bent knees. When nothing was said for several moments, Jacob heard Edward sigh. Before he could react, a cold hand caught the edge of his chin and forced it up. Jacob's eyes flew over on instinct, and he found himself caught in a golden gaze. A soft growl rumbled in his throat, even as the werewolf found himself leaning into the touch of his mate. "I thought you had imprinted on Bella," Edward murmured, one thumb coming to gently rub against Jacob's cheek. "No," Jacob said immediately, his voice almost hoarse. "How did you—" "I've been around enough years to know about the mechanics of werewolves." Edward raised a cool eyebrow and then it dropped. "It was selfish of me." "What?" Jacob blinked. "She is a pale substitute, but I longed for someone warm, someone full of life to hold close. The way she talked about you, I was so sure you'd take her as your mate, and I selfishly wanted as much of her as I could before that happened. It's not often that my kind can find comfort in the company of humans. To be able to both control ourselves around them and also have them know and accept what we are, well, Bella's a rarity." Edward shook his head. "She's stupid," Jacob said, the words biting out before he could stop them. Edward turned unnaturally still, and then he laughed. "Yes, I suppose she is. How many times she provoked me. It would have been so easy to allow the siren's call of her blood to consume me. But I couldn't do that. I need to stay here in Forks, though I hadn't known why." "Hadn't?" Jacob asked, trying to distract himself from the blessed coolness of that hand that had moved down from his chin to his neck. "We vampires rarely discuss it, but the call of our mates are just as powerful as imprinting is for you wolves," Edward said. "Though we do not have just one mate, we can be called to several." "You," Jacob stiffened, the unbidden image of Edward wrapped around a faceless figure entering his mind. "Shh." Edward's eyes crinkled slightly. "No, we have several potential mates, but once we've chosen one completely, it is for the rest of our lives, or theirs." "So Bella, she isn't your mate?" Jacob turned over this information in his head. And while on one hand he was disgusted to be having a civil conversation with a vampire, his werewolf instincts were reveling in the closeness of his imprinted. "No," Edward said. He shifted slightly, leaning closer to Jacob, and then pulling him in with vampiric strength. Jacob went willingly, moving as Edward wanted until they were leaning against each other. Edward's arm around his shoulder and Jacob's face tucked against the vampire's neck. "She is a potential, yes. That is the nature of the singers, the humans whose blood calls to us. It's to say that if the human were to be turned, then they would be a mate. The calling is often too strong. My brother Emmett came across one of his singers before, and he killed the boy before he could stop himself. But you don't want to turn her. Jacob let himself press closer to the vampire, both weirded out and comforted by the lack of heartbeat. Did I not say that already? There was amusement in Edward's tone. No, Jacob said. You just said that you like her warmth. Exactly. Edward praised as if Jacob were a child. Though Jacob's opposed to Edward, he was. And you, my wolf, are a furnace. Jacob felt blood rush to his cheeks, and he jerked back slightly to be able to look Edward in the eyes. You want me over Bella? Yes, Edward answered simply, eyes darkening. I would claim you as my mate, just as you have imprinted on me. He turned his head away suddenly, taking unnecessary breaths as if to control himself. I have very little interest in Forks as a town. The tribe, my pack, Jacob licked his lips. They would not accept me for this. Then find a new pack. My family will love you. Edward curled his hands around Jacob in what Jacob might call a possessive gesture. I will love you, if you'd let me. Love? Jacob wanted to ask, but of course the imprint was already working its magic on him, and so the word just served to comfort him. Would the Cullens be so bad a pack, he thought? Jacob growled low at the thought of leaving his family, but then again, they were a family more of necessity than of real adoration. He had always thought something was off with his connection to his current pack. And he just knew that even if the Cullens didn't like him, he would go anywhere to stay with this vampire that had stolen his heart with one glance. Okay, Jacob agreed softly. Edward smiled, and it was so blinding that Jacob felt his head rush. Thank you. Jacob shook his head. I am the one without much of a choice, he pointed out. But before an argument could start, he leaned in closer and took his vampire's mouth in with a brutal kiss. Edward puffed a laugh into his lips, and then pulled him closer, and Jacob let the sudden war of dominance and passion wage. He didn't know who would win in this, vampire or werewolf. And he wasn't even sure he cared. All that mattered was that this was Edward, his mate. His. Jacob growled and pushed harder towards his imprinted, nails digging into that marble back in rough happiness, as an answering growl escaped from Edward's mouth. And then, the only sounds that could be heard in the forest was the thumping of hard bodies, the scraping of nails and teeth, and the echoes of twin growls.